Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Georgia. The year was 1847 when the Caldwell estate stood proudly among the sprawling cotton fields of Wilkes County, Georgia. The plantation house, with its imposing white columns and wraparound porch, was considered the jewel of the region, sitting atop a gentle hill overlooking nearly 800 acres of land. The Caldwell name carried weight in local society circles, not only for their considerable wealth, but for the twin daughters who had become the subject of whispered conversations throughout the county. Elizabeth and Catherine Caldwell, identical in appearance, down to the small birthmark above their right eyebrows, had turned 22 that spring, well past the age when most young women of their station would have been married with children of their own. What few outside the plantation knew was that behind the perfectly maintained facade of Southern gentility, a series of events had been set in motion that would eventually unravel the very fabric of the Caldwell legacy. According to county records discovered during a courthouse renovation in 1952, the twins' mother had died during their birth, leaving their father, Thomas Caldwell, to raise them alone. Thomas had never remarried, dedicating his life to his daughters and the expansion of his cotton empire. The first indication that something was amiss at the Caldwell plantation came in the form of a letter written by the family's longtime housekeeper, Margaret Sullivan, to her sister in Savannah. The letter, dated April 8, 1847, mentioned that the young misses have taken to spending unusual amounts of time in the quarters, something the master seems strangely unconcerned about. This letter would later be discovered tucked inside a family Bible, preserved between its pages for over a century. The quarters Margaret referred to were the slave quarters, a collection of small wooden structures positioned approximately half a mile from the main house, just past a stand of oak trees that obscured them from view. The Caldwell plantation maintained approximately 70 enslaved individuals, a relatively modest number compared to some neighboring estates, but sufficient to work the land and maintain the household. Among these enslaved people were two men who would become central to the disturbing events that followed. According to plantation records preserved in the Georgia Historical Society archives, they were listed simply as Samuel and Elijah, both noted as having been purchased in 1842 from a plantation in South Carolina that had fallen into financial distress. What made Samuel and Elijah unusual, based on accounts compiled decades later by local historian William Hartwell, was their education. Both men had been taught to read and write by their previous owners' children, a dangerous skill that they had carefully concealed upon arrival at the Caldwell plantation. This concealment eventually failed, however, when Catherine Caldwell discovered Samuel reading a discarded newspaper in the stables late one evening in the autumn of 1846. Instead of reporting this illegal activity, Catherine, according to her personal diary, recovered in 1964 during the demolition of the old plantation house, began to meet Samuel in secret. The diary entries become increasingly cryptic around this time, with references to S and our shared understanding. Simultaneously, estate records show that Samuel was reassigned from field work to the stables, a position that afforded him greater proximity to the main house. What historical records do not clarify, but what local oral tradition suggests, is that Elizabeth had similarly formed a connection with Elijah, who worked primarily in the maintenance of the plantation's extensive gardens. The symmetry of these relationships, twin sisters forming forbidden bonds with two enslaved men, creates an unsettling pattern that would later be described by one local newspaper as a peculiar mirroring of forbidden affections. The winter of 1846 to 1847 was unusually harsh in Georgia, with freezing temperatures that damaged cotton stores and created a sense of isolation as roads became difficult to traverse. It was during these cold, isolated months that the relationships apparently deepened. A letter from Thomas Caldwell to his brother in Charleston, dated January 23, 1847, mentions his concern about a strange melancholy that has overtaken Elizabeth, while Catherine seems almost feverishly animated. I fear the isolation of this winter has affected their temperaments in opposite ways. What Thomas failed to perceive was that his daughters were not suffering from winter melancholy or cabin fever, but were instead engaged in a dangerous game of secrets and forbidden relationships that violated every social code of their time and place. The consequences of discovery would be devastating, not only for the enslaved men who could face torture or execution, but for the Caldwell name itself, which would be irreparably tarnished. The first concrete evidence of the true nature of these relationships emerged in a series of coded messages found pressed between the pages of a volume of poetry belonging to Elizabeth. These notes, written on scraps of paper and dated throughout February 1847, contain what appear to be arrangements for meetings and expressions of devotion. One particularly revealing note reads, "The usual place at midnight. The moon will be new, offering cover. He says E and S will join. 4 hearts beating us too." This suggestion that the twins were not only aware of each other's forbidden relationships, but were actively coordinating their clandestine meetings adds a layer of conspiracy to the unfolding narrative. Rather than acting independently, the sisters appeared to be operating in concert, their identical appearances perhaps even being used to confuse and misdirect any suspicion. The turning point came on March 15, 1847, when Thomas Caldwell announced at dinner that he had arranged marriages for both his daughters to the sons of prominent plantation owners in neighboring counties. According to the diary of Catherine, this announcement was met with outward composure, though beneath my smile, my heart turned to stone. Elizabeth's reaction is not recorded, but subsequent events suggest she shared her sister's opposition to their father's plans. 3 days after this announcement, in the early hours of March 18th, something happened that would forever change the course of the Caldwell family history. The plantation's overseer, James Whitaker, was awakened by what he described in a later deposition as a commotion unlike any I had heard before. Investigating, he discovered a small fire had been set in one of the storage buildings near the slave quarters. While the fire itself was quickly contained and caused minimal damage, the ensuing confusion revealed a more significant problem. Samuel, Elijah, and the Caldwell twins were nowhere to be found. A search was immediately organized, with neighboring plantations alerted and search parties dispatched along every road and trail leading from the Caldwell property. The initial assumption, recorded in Whitaker's journal, was that the enslaved men had escaped and, in an act of unfathomable boldness, had abducted the Caldwell daughters. A substantial reward was offered for their capture, and the situation quickly escalated into one of the largest manhunts in county history. Thomas Caldwell, according to accounts from those present, became a man possessed, barely eating or sleeping as the search continued. What the search parties did not know, and what would not be discovered until much later, was that the fire had been deliberately set by Elizabeth as a distraction. This detail would emerge in 1868, when a former house servant named Ruth provided testimony to a northern journalist documenting stories of the antebellum South. According to Ruth, Elizabeth had confided in her hours before the fire, instructing her to remain silent about what she knew. The search continued for weeks, expanding into neighboring counties and eventually across state lines. Meanwhile, Thomas Caldwell's health rapidly deteriorated. Plantation records show that by April he had taken to his bed, attended only by his longtime house servant and a physician from Augusta, who was called to the plantation twice during this period. Then, on May 2, 1847, a letter arrived at the Caldwell plantation. The contents of this letter have never been fully disclosed in any public record, but its effect was immediately apparent. Thomas Caldwell, upon reading it, suffered what his physician described as a paroxysm of rage, followed by a collapse from which he did not recover. He died 3 days later, the cause listed simply as apoplexy, a common term at the time for what we now recognize as a stroke. Following Thomas's death, control of the plantation passed to his brother Edward Caldwell, who traveled from Charleston to assume management of the estate. It was during Edward's methodical review of the plantation's affairs that a startling discovery was made in Thomas's private study: a small wooden box containing what appeared to be marriage certificates. These documents, crudely drawn but bearing signatures purported to record the marriage of Elizabeth Caldwell to Elijah and Catherine Caldwell to Samuel on the night of March 17th. The certificates were accompanied with a letter, apparently written by Catherine, explaining that the twins had fallen in love with the two men and, knowing their father would never approve, had devised a plan to escape together. The letter described how they had been secretly planning for months, saving small items, preparing for a journey north to states where they might live, if not openly, then at least without the immediate threat of capture and separation. Most disturbing to Edward, however, was the revelation that his nieces had not been abducted, but had gone willingly, choosing to abandon their privileged positions, their family name, and their entire social world for what Catherine described as the only true happiness we have ever known. The letter concluded with a request that their father try to understand and forgive them, though they recognized the unlikelihood of either. Edward Caldwell, after consulting with legal advisors and family connections, made a decision that would shape how the incident would be remembered. He buried the evidence. The certificates and letter were returned to the box and sealed away. Publicly, he maintained the story that his nieces had been abducted, possibly murdered by escaped slaves. The search continued, now focused on recovering bodies rather than living persons. This official narrative persisted for nearly 2 decades, until a development in 1865 changed everything. Following the Civil War and the emancipation of enslaved people throughout the South, a woman arrived at what remained of the Caldwell plantation. Now reduced to less than half its former size and struggling to adapt to the new economic reality, the woman identified herself as Margaret Johnson. But her resemblance to the long-missing Caldwell twins was unmistakable. She requested a meeting with Edward Caldwell, who still maintained the property, though with greatly reduced circumstances. According to the household staff present that day, the meeting lasted several hours, with raised voices occasionally audible through the closed doors of the study. When Margaret Johnson